Please welcome Lawrence Levy, author and the former chief financial officer of Pixar.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. I just listened to 3 amazing talks on Russian dictatorship, war, and the decline of Western civilization. And I'm here to talk about movies and meditation. But I actually think these things are connected. And by the time I get to the end of this, I hope to demonstrate that. This is one of the things I love about the Octavian Forum, by the way, which is this tremendous eclecticism in the topics and the different kinds of speakers they have. So I find that when I go around and meet and talk to people, I get asked very commonly 3 questions. The first question is, how is it that Pixar did it over and over again? We understand how it's possible to make a hit movie, but this company made like 15 hit movies in a row, and they were all multi-hundred-million-dollar smashes. So how did they do that? The second question is, what was it like working with Steve Jobs? And the third question is, why did you give it all up and go study Buddhist philosophy and meditation? So I thought I would put my talk today around those 3 topics. But let me start by setting the scene, which is how I got involved with Pixar in the first place. This was in 1994, and I was the chief financial officer of another company called Electronics for Imaging, which was in the graphic imaging business. I had taken that company public. That company is still around, actually, thriving. And I was sitting in my office, and my phone rang. In those days, a phone was like a box that you had on your table with buttons on it, and it was connected to the wall. And it rang, and I picked it up. And on the other end of the line, I heard this. Hi, this is Steve Jobs. I saw your picture in a magazine a couple of years ago, and I thought we might work together someday. I have a little company that I would like to tell you about. Inside, I said, he wants to talk to me about Next Computer. Next Computer was the company that he had famously started after he had been fired from Apple in 1986. And Next had shut down its hardware business. So I thought to myself, he wants help turning around Next. And then he said, it's called Pixar. And I said to myself inside, what on earth is Pixar? I don't think I'd even heard of it. But I said to him, sure, I'd love to learn about that. And we agreed to meet, and I hung up the phone. Now you might think that that's the greatest phone call in the world. The great Steve Jobs called me to go run the business of the great Pixar. But in 1994, nothing could have been further from the truth. Steve was probably at the lowest point of his career. He'd had several failures in a row. The Apple Lisa, the Apple Macintosh, the Next Computer, a whole bunch of them, and he was being written off. Pixar fared no better. It didn't take much research to realize that most people had written off Pixar as the little graphics company that Steve bought from George Lucas that never went anywhere. That's why the first chapter of my book is called, Why Would You Want to Do That? Because that's what everybody who I talked to about it said to me. But for reasons that I explain in the book, I did decide to do it. And then about 6 weeks later, after I started at Pixar, I came home and I said to my wife, Hillary, that I had made the biggest mistake of my career. And it sounds funny now looking back at it, but at the time, that's exactly how it felt. The reason I felt that is because I discovered some things when I went into Pixar that made it look even worse than I thought. The first was that at that moment, Pixar had a very toxic relationship with its owner, which was Steve Jobs. Steve had never worked at Pixar day by day. He was kind of an absentee landlord. And the company lived in fear that Steve would come along and destroy the delicate artistic culture that it had created. So that was a big problem. The second problem was that I had in my mind that Pixar had all these amazing technologies. It had this animation technology, this rendering technology, which is about drawing these high-end computer images. It made animated short films. It made commercials. It had this incredible machine for transferring digital images to film. And I thought all we had to do was kind of beef up the business of all of those technologies, and we'd build a business out of it. And it took me about 6 weeks to figure out that none of those had any chance of scaling up. And the third problem that I discovered was that Pixar had entered an agreement with the Walt Disney Company several years before I joined that basically tied up its hands for the better part of 12 to 14 years. So that even if Pixar was going to be successful in making films, it had no chance of making any money or profits from that. Disney had essentially put a stranglehold around Disney. At that moment in time, Pixar had what's called a negative capital, negative retained earnings, it's called, of negative $50 million. That means it had burned through $50 million of capital that came from Steve Jobs, and it had nothing to show for it. It had not produced any profits. 12 years later, we sold Pixar to the Walt Disney Company for $7.6 billion. So that negative 50 had become 7.6 billion. So here's some of the reasons why that was able to happen. The first question is, how was Pixar able to do it over and over again? So I'll give you a couple of clues about that. The first one is that Pixar decided to become an entertainment company. Now, you may be sitting there thinking that does not sound like a scintillating piece of wisdom, because it never occurred to you that Pixar was anything other than an entertainment company. Except in 1994, when I walked into the door at Pixar, no one, including anyone at Pixar, thought of Pixar as an entertainment company. Pixar was born a technology company. It was the computer graphics division of Lucasfilm. It made a computer, the Pixar imaging computer. They sold precisely this many of those computers and shut down that computer division a couple of years before I came on board. If in 1994 you wanted to build an entertainment company, I would be the last person that you would think about hiring to do it, because I knew nothing about the entertainment business. My entire career to that point in time had been in Silicon Valley. I could talk the language of software and hardware, computers and semiconductors, but for entertainment, nothing. When I realized that it was possible that Pixar had to become an entertainment company, I went to the library and I took out a book called The Entertainment Industry Economics by Hal Vogel. It is the driest book on the planet, full of charts and economic studies of the entertainment industry, but it's an absolute classic. Hal lives here in New York, and he's now on like the 14th edition of the book, but that's how I began to learn about the entertainment, the entertainment industry. The second problem with Pixar deciding to become an entertainment company is that the animated feature film business is the worst business in the world. At that point in time, only one company in history had succeeded at it. That was the Walt Disney Company. And they had only succeeded at it from 1937 to about 1944. 1937 was the release of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, first animated feature film. Then they did Dumbo and Bambi and a few others. Then Walt Disney realized he was almost always sort of on the edge of bankruptcy, and he realized that he could not sustain his company on animation alone. So he began to diversify. He bought a big piece of land in Anaheim, where he thought he might be able to exploit some of those characters that he had created. Of course, that became Disneyland. He went into television. He went into filmmaking. He made Mary Poppins in 1964. He started a film distribution company called Buena Vista. He did all these things to try to get out of the burden of trying to keep an animated feature film studio going. And every single other studio in the next couple of generations tried but failed to make it an animation. And that book, Entertainment Industry Economics, has a paragraph in it, which I quote in my book, that says, if you want to create a film company, the last thing that you should think about is trying to finance it in the equity markets. And he lists all the reasons. And I'm like, I think that's what Steve hired me to do, though, is finance this company through the equity markets, which means taking a company public. So what do you do? What do you do when your company has no hope in any of its businesses, and the one business that has even a glimmer is like the worst business, and every company you know has failed at it. The answer to that is you go for it. You go for it. The reason you go for it is because startups, which is really what Pixar was, but really all companies, but startups, the bane of startups is insufficient resources. Startups never have enough resources to get done what they want to do, which means that if you want to have any shot at all at making it in a startup, you have to curb all of your tendencies to hedge your bets. And you have to take one bet and bet everything on it. And the only bet that Pixar could make was in animated feature films. And I remember when I went to Steve and said, I think we've got to put it all on being an entertainment company. And he got on board with that, and then we started to shuttle back and forth to Hollywood in order to learn what that meant. And that's why that decision was so pivotal to what happened at Pixar. Another thing that's critical for doing any kind of sort of innovative work, I mean breakthrough innovative work, whether it's creative or otherwise, is the culture in which that work takes place. The culture of Pixar was pivotal to its success, and here's why. When you look at Pixar, you tend to see like John Lasseter and Andrew Stanton and now these film directors that have kind of become household names. And you think, wow, this is a company that has this amazing talent, and that's why they're making these great movies. But that talent is a necessary but insufficient condition in order to succeed in the entertainment or any other business. The reason for that is because there are these tensions that pull against each other. In Pixar's case, there were three. There was the story or the entertainment talent, the filmmaking talent. There was the problem of the technology, and then there were challenges of the business, how the business impacted those two. So I'll give you some examples of that. We all know the beginning of Toy Story takes place in Andy's room. Actually, if you watch most of Toy Story, you will see that 3/4 of the film takes place in small spaces, like Andy's room. That's because small spaces, graphically, are much easier to do than outdoor spaces in terms of computer graphics. It's not until you get to the end of the film at Toy Story that you finally get this big outdoor scene where they're rushing through the streets to try to catch the delivery truck. At Pixar, there was extreme doubt about whether that last scene was possible to do. So you can imagine these conversations going with the film directors like John Lasseter going to the technical directors saying, we need this big outdoor scene, we need roads, we need cars, we need trees. And the first thing they say is, well, I'll give you roads, but no cars and no trees. So then you're going to have like a treeless, carless climax to the film Toy Story. So this somehow got worked out. By the way, if you watch the end of the scene of Toy Story and you look at those trees, you'll see that the leaves in them don't move. They're completely static. It's like there's no motion in them whatsoever. If you go to Pixar's second film, which is A Bug's Life, and the opening scene of the film, it goes into some leaves, and those leaves are swaying in the wind. This is like enormous technological breakthrough for Pixar. How does a company like that harmonize those kinds of tensions? Because they can really pull things apart. And the answer in Pixar's case was that I characterized Pixar as a talking company. It's a company where if you wanted to get anything done, you had to talk to 20 people. It was like a pain in the ass. You couldn't move anywhere without talking to everyone. Why is that important? A top-down organization that makes decisions from the top going down is very efficient. It's much more efficient to have a few people at the top make all the decisions and tell everyone what to do. But the price for doing that is poor information at the top. It's almost impossible for the people at the top of the company to get sufficient information to make the decisions they need. The narrower the pyramid, the less information gets to the top, to the point where you're almost making decisions at the top based on hunches and instinct and things like that. If you want to get information to flow, you have to flatten the organization and have a tremendous amount of communication. And that's precisely what Pixar did. Flat organization, extremely inefficient, but the flow of information was huge. The business side of that, which was my side of it, impacted it in these ways. One of the biggest decisions that Pixar had to make at the beginning was how many films to make. I had all these spreadsheets and everything like that from all the finance people that made it very clear how many films to make, like 3 a year, right? Because the risk of films missing was so great that you just had to have enough product coming through. And then the creative people say, we can make one film every 4 years. It takes 4 years, about 200 people to make an animated feature film. And at that time, they could only make one film every 4 years. So we had to hammer out how often to make films. And it's very easy for the business executives to put too much pressure on the creative forces, which ends up destroying the creative culture. You get more films, but you don't have the quality. But the single biggest decision in this realm that was true for Pixar, and I would argue is true for any company doing any kind of creativity at all, whether you're just putting a logo on a bottle or something like that, is who has creative control? Who has the final say? And the challenge with any of this kind of work is that the executives rarely have the information to make the final say. They're not as good as the creative people. But executives get very worried about handing over creative control to creative people, whether it's the creative people or engineers or whomever it is. The reason for that is because creative mistakes are very expensive mistakes. When you go halfway through a project or halfway through making a film or any kind of innovative work, and you realize that your main character isn't working, or the film isn't funny, or the product isn't working, or anything like that, the cost of backtracking is huge. And so executives don't like to take those risks. As soon as a mistake comes, they want to take back the project and take control over it. But the thing is, in any kind of innovative work, any startup, any kind of innovative work anywhere, mistakes are not an option. And I mean the kind of mistakes where you think like, it's not just a little mistake, like we got the color wrong or we got the wording wrong. It's like the kind of mistake where we have completely gone down the wrong direction. I don't think Pixar made a film yet where it didn't reach that point. It's like legislated into the process. Okay, we're in our crisis point now, right? But you think you could like figure your way out of it, but you can't, because for every film it's different, and for every film it's a major crisis. And the thing is that what do the executives do then? It's easy at the beginning to say, sure, go make your film. But it's at that moment that you have to trust your creative people. And Pixar did that. We made a decision. We talked about it. We decided. We sort of the three executives running the business, who was Steve Jobs, myself, and Ed Catmull, we were not going to intervene with the creative decisions. We were going to trust the creative people to work their way out of things. That meant when Andrew Stanton came to the executive team in Pixar and said, I want to make a film about a robot called Wall-E. And by the way, that is going to be a silent film. And we need $100 million to make it. You take a giant-sized gulp and you say, go for it. But it's not easy to do that. But this was also very pivotal to Pixar's success. So let me get to the second question. What was it like working with Steve Jobs? So the answer in a word was, it was great. It was amazing. Steve and I hit it off from the get-go. We had the great chemistry. Steve, as you know from any story about him, was very intense. Steve was often the smartest guy in the room, and he had opinions and views about everything. And whatever view he had about every subject that he had it on, he held that view with like a religious conviction. And the thing was, in working with Steve, was that you couldn't buy into what he was saying just because of his conviction, because that's not an argument. So you had to work with him by standing up there and saying, I don't care how much conviction, let's reason our way through this. And what I discovered about Steve is that he was much more interested in getting to the right answer than being right. And there's a very big difference. And therefore, we had this constant debate going on, a constant dialogue. We would go walking through the streets of Palo Alto talking about all these issues. Often one of us would take one side and then we'd flip sides until we could work things out. One example of that was whether Pixar should go into the business of making live action films. Because live action film is a very obvious way to diversify an animated film company. You understand the film business, you've got theatrical distribution, you're making these animated films. Why don't we also go, figure out how you hire actors and directors and make normal films, live action films. So we went back and forth on this until we finally figured out the answer. And the answer was that Pixar decided not to go into the business of live action film. And the reason for that is because we figured out that both live action film and animated feature film were terrible businesses. And one was not going to offset the risks of the other. So we were just going to take our bet and go for it. But that was the kind of thing that we would debate. I think this kind of collaboration is the unsung hero of excellence. You talk to people and you say, "Are you a good collaborator?" Everybody says they're a good collaborator. Of course, I'm a great collaborator. But here was my experience with collaboration with Steve and with Pixar. You need two things to have a great collaboration. You need to have the right people, and you need to listen to them. So having the right people is very difficult, because whenever you come to have a meeting or make a decision, often the first thing that comes to mind is, who are the people that should be in the meeting? And then you have all kinds of politics and all kinds of seniority and who needs a seat at the table. Steve and myself never asked that question. The only question was, who absolutely must be in this discussion to make the best decision we can? That's it. So, and Steve was relentless about this. So you have to try to when you collaborate on any particular decision or project, got to be with the right people. The second problem, the second challenge, and this is almost, I think, harder, is you have to listen to them. It's very hard listening to contrary voices. That's because, as we well know today, we have a strong tendency towards confirmation bias. We give more value and weight to the opinions that agree with our own. We like to live in what we call today our own echo chambers. And that is really difficult when it comes to collaboration. So Pixar had a way around this. And it was a phrase, you probably all heard of the phrase. It was called "leave your ego at the door." So when you come into a meeting to make some difficult decisions, to solve problems, leave your ego at the door means get your personal agenda out of the way. This has nothing to do with you. Right? The problem here is a creative problem, or it could be a political problem, or whatever the problem is, but this is the problem. And your ego, your personal agenda, has nothing to do with it. We're here to solve the problem. The problem with leaving your ego out the door goes like this. You arrive at the meeting and you're absolutely convinced you should leave your ego at the door. So you get to the door and you take out your ego and you put your ego and you say, "sit," right? And then you go in and you close the door and you put wooden boards over the door and you padlock the door and you bolt the door and you just put a steel thing over the door. There's the ego at the door. Now you're at the meeting, no ego, having a good meeting. The first time that somebody makes any comment that is critical of your point of view, the ego will blast through that door and come up and be sitting right in front of the desk. The challenge is, how do you get yourself out of your own way if you want to do great, innovative, collaborative work? And Pixar was masterful at figuring out how to do that. So now let me turn to the third question. Why did I give it all up and go study Buddhist philosophy and meditation? So I loved my career. I loved Pixar. I was with the company for 12 years in Silicon Valley for quite some time before that. So I saw a lot happen in my years in Silicon Valley and in Hollywood, and I loved it all. But I saw a problem. I saw what I would call a one-dimensionality to it. I saw that the single driver behind sort of modern corporate life was what I call acquisition at all costs. Or you could also call it performance at all costs, or profit at all costs. And I began to observe that there were some costs that were really taking a toll. Those costs take the form of very high levels of stress, very high levels of anxiety. In this weekend's New York Times magazine, the lead story is about teenage anxiety in America. And the numbers are staggering about the increase in teen anxiety over the last 20 years. This is a pure trickle-down from this corporate mentality of performance at all costs. I also saw not only was there increasing levels of stress, but I could observe that there were low levels of meaning, low levels of self-esteem, low levels of joy. I began to see what seemed to me at least, that people had lost touch with what was important, were defined by the work that they were doing instead of allowing the work they were doing to help them lead great lives. And the third problem that I saw was that technology was becoming a problem. That not only were we becoming more and more tethered to technology, but we were becoming addicted to it. The more connected we are digitally, the more connected we are virtually, it seems the more lonely we become in the real world. Loneliness has become an epidemic in the last 10 years, even though we're more connected than at any time in history. So I decided to go off and try to understand what this was all about. And the reason that I did that through Buddhist philosophy was because in that philosophy, what I saw was an exquisite methodology of the mind. It's all about the human mind and how we realize its potential. But I hit a snag because, like with any other endeavor, if you want to become an athlete or a musician or a mathematician or anything, you need teachers. You can only learn so much out of a book. If you want to go very deeply into any topic, you need someone to guide you. And I went off to find someone to guide me, and I couldn't. So this was like 15 years ago now. I met all these Tibetan masters that were absolutely amazing, but there was just this huge chasm between us culturally. I couldn't connect or relate enough. And eventually I did find one. And he became my teacher, he still is, and with him I created, and 3 other people, we created a foundation, that's the work I do today, to bring these ideas to contemporary life. That's called the Juniper Foundation. But I'll give you, if I came to one conclusion through all of this investigation in the last 20 years, it is this. It is that prosperity alone is not enough. Prosperity will not free us from the treadmill of performance. Prosperity will not cure us of the conflicts, the divisions, the biases, the patriarchy, and all of these problems that we're still dealing with today. And prosperity will not instill in us qualities like compassion, loving kindness, joy, humility, and dignity. For that, we need something else. We have to marry our capacity for outer mastery, by which I mean the expansion of the material world, with our capacity for inner mastery, by which I mean the capacity of the mind. And that second part is something we have completely ignored in contemporary culture. And that's where meditation comes in. Meditation is not about focusing the mind or reducing your stress or anything like that. It's not about listening to an app that says just be calm for 5 minutes. I mean, those things are great, but that's not what the great meditation masters were talking about. They were talking about a transformation of human experience. It is a methodology to remake the narratives that keep us imprisoned in places that we can't move away from. Even a lot of the talk today is about narratives. We're imprisoned in narratives about war, about politics, about government. These are all narratives. Performance culture is a narrative that is torturing us. Meditation is a means to unwind those narratives. It's a means to smooth out the jagged edges of our emotions that just keep us unhappy or agitated or stressed. And I'll finish this by giving one example from this philosophy that will also tie it back to Pixar. The root of this philosophy that I've studied and still do is called the middle way. That's my talk today. Pixar, Steve Jobs, and the middle way. You can tell we're getting to the end because I'm on the middle way part. The middle way is a philosophy, and it basically says we will never find contentment in extremes. So, I hear all the speakers, especially, the last ones, talking about the extremes that we're seeing in our world, in our culture, in our politics, in our government. And we have to push away from extremes. This idea was born 2,000 years ago. We need to push off of extremes if we're to find contentment, well-being, on a lasting basis. So one way to think about that, there are many ways to frame it, but here's one. It's as if we have two people inside of us. One person inside of us is a bureaucrat. And the job of the bureaucrat is to get things done. The bureaucrat worries about whether you're going to get to the airport on time to catch the plane, how much money there is in the bank, whether there's enough for retirement, who's going to make dinner, who's going to make the bed, all of those things. The bureaucrat is kind of a warrior. Then there's another person inside of us. Call that person like an artist or a free spirit. That artist or free spirit doesn't care about any of that other stuff, just wants to live, love, create, be, enjoy, breathe. That's all that free spirit wants to do. And the middle way would say, if you get stuck in either of those places, you may end up frustrated. If life is all about the bureaucratic side, all I care about is measuring. How much money do I have in the bank? How many hours did I work this week? How many Facebook likes? How many LinkedIn friends do I have? Or whatever it is. Then you may accumulate a lot of stuff, but you might one day wake up and wonder, did you ever really live? If, on the other hand, stuck in that free spirit, I'm just smelling the roses, that's all I do, that's all I care about, then the problem is you might get very frustrated by a lack of momentum. And that is precisely where I found Pixar in 1994. Pixar was the ultimate free spirit, full of creativity, full of innovation, full of all this stuff. But if I used one word to describe Pixar in 1994, it would be frustrated. Frustrated for the lack of momentum that the company had. Everyone working at Pixar in 1994 had seen how all their friends' companies had gone public, and they had been toiling away at this for 10 years. Essentially, what we did at Pixar was put enough bureaucracy, enough administration, enough strategy around that creative spirit to give it momentum without killing it. And this was the secret to what made Pixar do what it did, but it's also the secret not just for Pixar, but for doing great work, for living great lives. These ideas that I've talked about today, the power of focus, the power of collaboration and harmony, and the power of meditation in the middle way, I believe that these are tools that can help us not just do great work, but also to live great lives and to tackle all the problems that we've talked about today with dignity, with humility, with compassion, and with joy. So there you have it. Thank you very much for having me.